Our first speaker this afternoon is Amy Griffin from the University of New South Wales, Canberra, and she's going to be talking about designing across map use contexts.
Okay, thanks, Martha. So the reason I decided to give this talk, which is kind of, it's a pretty academic-y talk, but I wanted to give this talk at NASAS because I actually would really like some feedback on the ideas in this paper from people who actually make maps for a living. So please feel free to tell me, and Carolyn Fish is another author on this paper. Tell us if you think we are nuts or not. We're really interested in whether you think this idea has any practical applicability, whether you see it could have any value for the practice of cartography. We don't know, it's just an idea, so I hope you'll give us your frank feedback. Okay, so here on this slide you see two different uses of maps, right? They're both maps that are kind of used for wayfinding or figuring out where you are, but the devices that we use are different. The environments are different. In one case, you're in an urban environment. The other case, you're out somewhere in a natural environment. So there's a lot of differences between these two maps that have some similarities in terms of how they're used. So the basic thing that we were thinking about in this work was how can we take what we know about what is good about a particular design and then repurpose it or reuse it or tweak it for another similar situation or a situation that has some level of similarity. Okay, so why do we even find ourselves in this situation in the first place? Thankfully, because people are using and making more maps than they ever have before. The barriers to making your own maps have gone down a lot. You no longer need specialist skills to be able to do it. And we find maps being used for all different kinds of purposes. And while we've studied some of those uses reasonably well, there's other uses we haven't studied at all. So if we wanted to look to past experience, maybe there's not even anything to look for. Another thing is that because we have so many different contexts in which maps are used, there's usually not a study that's had all the same elements of context. Right? So there's never going to be a study that perfectly matches whatever it is you're trying to design your map for. So the key thing we're trying to do here is trying to understand what bits of what we know from study of map use could be transferred to a new context. So we're drawing on an idea called transferability, which has its roots in qualitative research. When people do qualitative research, their goal isn't necessarily to be able to define the laws that describe all behavior or something like that, but to be able to understand what elements of something that happens in one place might be expected to occur in another place. So we're sort of borrowing from that idea of transferability rather than generalizability, which is what we often do in a very controlled experiment. Okay, so we have a basic context model that we've come up with, looked at how a lot of other researchers have defined context, including researchers from computer science, and I'll say a little bit more about these 4 elements in a minute, but we basically have four categories of context information that we're interested in. So things that have to do with the user, okay, so individual characteristics of that user, things that have to do with what they're using the map for or what they're doing when they're using the map. So are they using it for navigation? Are they using it to make policy decisions about the environment? Are they using it for any range of different activities? The environment in which they're using it. So you saw a map on the previous screen of some firefighters that were looking at a map, trying to decide perhaps where they were putting in a fire break or something like that. The physical environment in which they're working is very different to sitting at a desk. So what are the elements of the environment that actually affect how they use that map? And then there's the map itself, right? So which data are being put on the map? Is it relatively sparse data, or is it millions of records of data? What device is being used? What are they looking at it on? Are they looking at a device on their smartphone? Are they looking at a device on a wall-sized display? Are they using a paper map? All of those different devices afford different visual possibilities when we're actually designing the map. So those are some of the kinds of factors that we're thinking about here. So we know that there's this suite of context factors that might influence whether a particular design is successful in supporting whatever the activity is. But not all of them are necessarily relevant to every single map use situation, and I'll illustrate this in a practical example in just a minute. So the idea of relevance is that out of all these potential things that could affect the use, which ones are important for that particular situation? Because those are the things that are likely to be most important for affecting the design, right? And the limits and constraints that we're working with when we're deciding on a design. So we can think of context as being some kind of filter, right? So we have these things, all of them are factors, but only these ones in the middle are really the relevant and important characteristics, right? So some of the questions that we're asking are, well, how do we figure out what those relevant factors are? Are there some factors that are relevant for every single type of map use that might be out there? Maybe. We don't really know that. And what do those contextual factors tell us about the transferability of a design from one use to another use? Okay, so here are some of the context factors that we focused on in this paper, and I forgot to say there is an actual paper that's written on this, and I'm happy to send it to anyone if you just contact me and I'll email it to you, so you can find out all the details that I won't have time to talk about in this talk. So for users, some of the things that we identified as being potentially important and things that we don't know enough about already about map use include things like spatial abilities, right? We know that everybody here probably has a friend who seems to be completely incapable of either finding their way in the real world or using a map to support that navigation. My brother, who is 40 years old, still cannot drive himself from my parents' house to my uncle's house. He's been doing it for 40 years, taking that trip for 40 years, and every time he still gets lost. It's like he's missing the navigation chip somewhere. So there are people who have different levels of spatial ability, because there are also other people who always seem to know where they're going, who never seem to lose their way. So those are individual differences between people, and they of course affect whether or not a map use is successful. Various forms of disability. Okay, so color vision impairment is one that many people have, but there's other types of disability that might affect your map use, okay? Whether you're partially sighted or you have no sight at all, for example. People also have affective and emotional responses to maps. We know relatively little about that in a sort of systematic and structured way. It's an area that hasn't had a lot of research. And there's a whole range of individual differences that we could think about that might be relevant. In terms of the environment, we identified two categories of information. So one is the physical environment itself. So for example, it might be quite cold, or it might be very hot. You can think about a map of a national park. And let's just, because we're in Canada, let's think of a national park in Canada. Well, let's see, you look at your national parks map, and you're trying to figure out what activities you might do. Well, in the summertime, the lake affords you the ability to do certain kinds of things, like swimming, right? But in the wintertime, you're certainly not, well, most people won't go swimming in a lake in Canada in the winter, right? But they might ski across it, okay? So the physical environment in which you're doing things might vary. Right? The level of distraction. So we are often using maps now in places with lots of distraction, places that are noisy, that have lots of other things that are demanding our attention and pulling our attention away from the map and to something else. Right? Even driving your car is a high distraction environment in heavy traffic, for example. So factors about the physical and the environment. Activity. So what are you actually doing while you're using the map? Are you wayfinding? Are you using the map to make decisions about a policy decision? There's a range of different things that we might use the map for. Time of use. Are you using the map at night? Are you using it during daylight? Right? Everybody who uses a GPS in their car sees that oftentimes the display will change when it's dark, right? And that's because it's harder to see that first design in certain levels of light. So that's just a very elementary kind of time of use thing, but there are other ways that we can think about time of use and how they might affect the map use. And are you doing this activity by yourself, or are you doing it in conjunction with other people? Do they need to be able to see the same display at the same time? Are they in the same location when they're doing this joint activity with you or not? And then finally, the map itself. So there's characteristics of the information that's used in the map, and that could be things like how fast are the data updated, right? And some data sets are updated now on the fly in real time or in very near real time. If you think about how police or disaster managers or some those sorts of tasks use these data, they really need up-to-the-minute data. So how does that affect how we represent and display that information? We use them on all these different kinds of devices that have different resolutions, that have different sizes, that are made of different materials, right? So that can be important. We can think about the representation type itself. So what kind of map are we using? How do we interact with it? Is it a touch screen? Is it voice activated? There's a range of ways we interact with maps. And then interaction modes as well. So let me just give you an example of how we thought this might be used. So here we're considering two map use situations that have some level of similarity. So imagine two different drivers. They're both alone in the car. They're using the same in-car GPS device to navigate to the same destination across the city, and it's during rush hour. It's not particularly warm. It's not particularly cold. There's no rain falling. In map use situation A, the driver is unfamiliar with the city, has no arrival deadline. In map use situation B, the driver is a local, has an arrival deadline, and additionally, this particular user has a red-green color vision impairment. Okay? So with this context information, what can we say about how we should design maps for those two particular users? Okay, so if we use these four categories of information, what can we find? Okay, the map user. So the users in situations A and B have three relevant contextual differences. So one is color vision impairment, right? So, and this is just a simulation of what the standard red-green sort of traffic symbology shows. And you can see that for the color vision impaired person, it's quite difficult, right? Other individual differences might not be relevant, like age or gender. But things like familiarity with the city might be important. So in one case, number of turns might disturb one user more than the other. And time pressure is also different between the two of them. Right? Map use environment. Here we could probably say, well, there's really not any relevant differences between these two drivers. They're both in the same car, they're using the same in-car GPS device, they're in the same traffic. Map use activity. Here we're using the same, doing the same task, right, at the same time with the same number of people. So we would say maybe there's nothing relevant here, right? And finally, the map itself. So the maps in both situations are on the same device, but if situation B, the one where they have time pressure, they might want to change their route if the traffic gets difficult. And maybe the device does that on its own, but maybe they need to input into the device. So the way they interact with that map might need to be different. So when we look at all these things together, we came up with this set of relevant contextual differences and potential design solutions that we would apply to those different situations. Okay? So this is just an example of how we thought we might use this model in reality to customize a design to a particular situation. Right? So for example, we might use a different symbology for the color vision impaired person. We might reduce the number of street labels for a person who's unfamiliar. We might give a route with a shorter travel time, but that's simpler, for example. Or so a longer travel time, but it's simpler. All right, so we identified also some open research questions that we don't really know about to actually use this model effectively. So which contextual information is important for making these judgments? How can we actually organize that information so that we can make design decisions? And does the amount of information that's needed to make those design judgments vary from a novice cartographer to an expert cartographer? Perhaps more information is important for the novice than for the expert. And what are the reliability and validity of this? So how often does it give us a good suggestion on what we could do differently for the two situations? So in summary, we have a context model that we think could be used to identify these differences. We've identified some specific research needs to actually use the model effectively. And better description of context information could help us all understand why things are successful in particular map use situations. So I'll stop there, and I would really like practicing cartographers to tell me, like, do you think about this in that way if you have a design and you're tweaking it for a new use? I'm curious. What do you do?